The executive vice president grabbed Daniel Carter's resume off the table, held it up in front of 40 employees, and tore it clean in half. "A failure like you doesn't belong here." The paper fluttered into the trash can. Somebody laughed. Daniel, 36 years old, a widower, a father who hadn't slept a full night in 3 years, didn't say a word. He picked up his cracked briefcase and walked out into the rain. But he left something on that table. 3 engineering sketches. And 40 floors up, a woman was already staring at them, her hands beginning to shake. Because those sketches were about to burn this entire company to the ground, and the man who tore them in half had no idea what he'd just thrown away. Before we go on, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far this story travels. And if you believe a good man should never be judged by his worst chapter, subscribe and stay with me all the way to the end. You won't want to miss what happens next. The rain hadn't started yet when Daniel Carter walked through the glass doors of Bennett Construction Group. He'd shined his shoes that morning at the kitchen table while his daughter still slept. He'd used a butter knife to scrape the mud off the soles because the polish had run out 2 months ago and there was no money for more. He'd pressed his one good shirt with an iron borrowed from the neighbor across the hall, and he'd stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time practicing. "My name is Daniel Carter. I'm a structural engineer. I know there's a gap in my history, and I'd like the chance to explain it." He'd said it out loud over and over until the words stopped shaking. Now he stood in the lobby of the tallest building he'd walked into in 4 years, holding his briefcase against his chest like a shield. And he felt every one of those 4 years pressing down on his shoulders. A young woman at the front desk looked up. "Can I help you?" "Daniel Carter. I have a 10 o'clock interview with the engineering department." She scanned a screen. Her smile flickered just slightly, just enough. "Take the elevator to the 14th floor. Someone will meet you." "Thank you," he said. "Thank you very much." He meant it. He'd learned in the last 3 years to mean thank you the way a drowning man means air. Upstairs, the 14th floor was an open room the size of a basketball court. Desks in rows. Screens glowing. Maybe 40 people typing, talking, drinking coffee out of paper cups. Daniel stood at the edge of it and felt like a man who had wandered onto a stage in the middle of a play he didn't know the lines to. A woman with a clipboard found him. "Mr. Carter?" "Yes." "Mr. Harrington will see you. He's the executive vice president. He likes to conduct first-round interviews personally." She said it like it was a privilege. Daniel would remember that later. She led him between the desks. He was aware of eyes lifting off screen, sliding over him, going back down. He knew what they saw. A man in a shirt that had been washed too many times. A briefcase that had been new during a different presidency. Shoes that no amount of butter knife scraping could make young again. He didn't care what they saw. He cared about one thing and one thing only. He had $411 in his checking account. His daughter's inhaler prescription was due to be refilled in 9 days. And if he got this job, everything changed. That was the whole world. $411 and a little girl named Emma who couldn't breathe right when the seasons turned. Gerald Harrington did not stand up when Daniel entered his glass-walled office. He was a big man, mid-50s, silver-haired, the kind of man who had learned early that a room bends toward whoever refuses to be nervous in it. He gestured at a chair without looking up from Daniel's resume. "Sit." Daniel sat. Harrington read for a while in silence. He let the silence stretch. It was a technique, and Daniel recognized it, and he waited it out. "Structural engineering degree," Harrington finally said. "Good school, licensed. First 4 years you've got some real projects here. The Kettner Overpass, the Ridgeline Medical Tower." He looked up for the first time. "That's serious work, Carter." "Thank you, sir." "And then?" Harrington turned the page, tapped it. "Then nothing. For almost 4 years, nothing." He looked at Daniel over the top of the page. "You want to explain that to me?" This was the moment. Daniel had practiced this moment in front of a bathroom mirror. "Yes, sir. I'd like to. 4 years ago, my wife was diagnosed with..." Because from where I'm sitting, Harrington said, talking right over him, A 4-year gap tells me one of two things. Either nobody would hire you, or you decided you didn't feel like working. He set the resume down. Which one is it? Neither, sir. My wife got sick. I became the full-time caregiver, and after she passed, I became a full-time single father to our daughter. She has severe asthma. There were hospital stays. I made a choice to... So you didn't feel like working. The words landed flat in the room. Daniel felt something go tight in his chest. That's not what I said, sir. You said you made a choice. Harrington spread his hands. That's a choice not to work. I'm just repeating you back to yourself. I made a choice to keep my daughter alive, Daniel said, and his voice was very level, and that levelness cost him more than shouting would have. I'd make it again. Harrington studied him for a moment. Then he did something Daniel didn't expect. He smiled. You know what your problem is, Carter? You think that's a virtue. Daniel would replay the next 90 seconds for a long time afterward. In the version he told himself late at night, he stood up. He said something sharp and clean and final, something that made Harrington's face fall. In the real version, he sat there and absorbed it, because he had $411 and an inhaler due in 9 days, and a man in his position does not get to have pride. Let me tell you how the world actually works, Harrington said, leaning back. This is a company that builds things, big things, things that cannot fall down. And when I put a man on a project, I need to know he'll be there. At 6 in the morning, at midnight if the concrete cure's wrong, on the weekend on his kid's birthday on Christmas if that's what it takes. He pointed at the resume. And what you're telling me proudly, God help me proudly, is that the first time your personal life got hard, you walked away from your career for 4 years. What happens the next time it gets hard? Carter, your kid gets a cold. You disappear on me for a month. My wife died, sir. That's not a cold. I'm sorry for your loss. Harrington said it the way you'd read it off a card. But I'm not running a charity. I'm running a business, and a business can't afford a man who folds. Daniel's hands were flat on his knees. He kept them there. I'm not asking for charity, he said. I'm asking for a chance to prove I can still do the work. Look at the sketches. I brought sketches, current work. Just look at them. He opened the briefcase. His hands weren't quite steady. He drew out 3 sheets of paper engineering drawings done in pencil at his kitchen table over the last 8 months, in the hours between Emma falling asleep and Daniel falling asleep. He'd worked out a load distribution problem that had been rattling around his head like a stone in a shoe. He didn't have software anymore. He'd sold the laptop. He'd done it all by hand. He laid them on the desk and turned them to face Harrington. Harrington did not look at them. I don't need to look at doodles, Carter. They're not... Here's what I need. Harrington stood up. And when he stood, the interview was already over, and everybody outside the glass walls knew it because they had started to gather. Daniel became aware of them the way you become aware of a change in weather, a pressure, a crowd forming just beyond the glass drawn by some office instinct that always knows when someone is about to be destroyed. Harrington picked up the resume. He walked around the desk. He opened the glass door so that the whole floor could hear, and he held the resume up like a man holding up evidence. I need people who can hear the truth, he said loud now, performing now. So here's the truth, Carter. You had a career. You threw it away. And now you show up here in that shirt with these. He snatched the 3 sketches off the desk, crumpled them into a ball in one fist. These napkins, and you expect me to hand you a job at one of the biggest firms in this state? Give those back. Daniel was on his feet now, too. Something in his voice had changed. Those are mine. Give them back. A failure like you, Harrington said, doesn't belong here. And he tore the resume in half, then in half again, and he dropped the pieces into the trash can beside his door, and he tossed the crumpled ball of sketches in after it, and somewhere in the crowd of 40 people, somebody laughed. A short, ugly laugh. The kind that comes out before a person can stop it. Daniel stood in the doorway of the glass office. 40 faces looked at him. He looked back at them one by one, and not one of them held his eyes. He reached into the trash can. He took out the crumpled ball of his own sketches, just those, not the torn resume. He left the resume where it lay, and he smoothed the ball once against his chest, and he put it in his briefcase, and he closed the briefcase, and he clicked the latches shut. "Thank you for your time," he said. He said it to Harrington. He meant it the way a drowning man means air. It was the last thing his father had taught him before he died, that you thank people, even the ones who spit on you, because your manners belong to you and not to them. And nobody can tear those in half. Then he walked out through the rows of desks past 40 people who wouldn't look at him to the elevator. He pressed the button. He waited. Behind him, the office slowly returned to the sound of typing, as if he had never been there at all. The elevator came. The doors closed on Daniel Carter's face, and 40 floors up in an office none of them could see into. A woman had been watching the whole thing on a security feed with her coffee going cold in her hand. Outside, the rain had started. It came down hard and gray and cold, the kind of October rain that soaks through a washed thin shirt in about 90 seconds. Daniel didn't have an umbrella. He'd never owned one that didn't break. He stood under the building's overhang for a moment, watching the water hammer the sidewalk, and he did the math again, the way a man worries a bad tooth with his tongue. $411. Rent was $600 due in 3 weeks. The inhaler was $90 after the discount card due in 9 days. He'd been counting on this job the way you count on a bridge being there when you drive toward it in the dark. He'd been so sure. That was the part that hollowed him out. He'd stood in front of that mirror and practiced, and he'd let himself believe just a little, just enough to hurt, that today the gap in his history would finally be seen for what it was. Not a failure, a father, a man who'd been standing exactly where he was supposed to stand. You had a career. You threw it away. Daniel closed his eyes. He thought about Rebecca. He always did. In the worst moments, she showed up in his mind, like she was still around a corner somewhere, still just out of sight. 3 years gone, and he still turned to tell her things. He turned to tell her this. They didn't even look at the sketches, Becca. 8 months of work, and he crumpled them up in his fist and called them napkins, and he could hear her clear as the rain. Then he's a fool, Danny. Don't you dare let a fool tell you what you're worth. Daniel opened his eyes. He gripped the briefcase handle, and he stepped out into the rain, because Emma got out of school at 3, and a father does not get to stand under an overhang, feeling sorry for himself when his daughter is going to come running out those double doors, looking for his face in the crowd. He put his head down, and he walked. He was half a block down the sidewalk, already soaked to the skin when he heard it. "Wait, sir. Wait, please." He didn't stop. People shouted things on the street. It wasn't for him. Nothing good had ever come running after Daniel Carter in the rain. "Daniel Carter, please stop." That did stop him. His name, his full name, called out over the sound of the storm in a voice he didn't recognize. He turned around. A woman was running toward him through the rain. And running was the wrong word for it. She was sprinting in a charcoal suit that was worth more than 3 months of Daniel's rent in heels, with no coat and no umbrella. Her dark hair plastered flat to her head, holding something against her chest to keep it dry. She'd come out of the building he'd just been thrown out of. She was already as soaked as he was. She reached him and stopped breathing hard rain running off her chin. "Mr. Carter," she said. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I had to. I ran down 14 flights. The elevator was too slow. I thought I was going to miss you." "Ma'am," Daniel said carefully, "I think you have me confused with someone. You're Daniel Carter. You did the Ridgeline Medical Tower. The cantilever solution on the east wing, the one everybody said couldn't hold, and it held." She wiped rain out of her eyes. "That was you. I know it was you." Daniel stood very still. Nobody had said the words Ridgeline Medical Tower to him in almost 4 years. Nobody had said them like they mattered. "That was a long time ago," he said. "I don't care how long ago it was." And here she took the thing she'd been shielding against her chest and held it out to him, and Daniel looked down, and his heart did something painful. It was his sketches. The 3 crumpled sheets. She'd taken them out of the trash can. She'd smoothed them flat. She'd been carrying them pressed to her body, sheltering them from the rain, running down 14 flights of stairs to catch a stranger on the sidewalk. "Where did you get those?" Daniel said. It didn't come out as a question. It came out as something closer to fear. Out of the garbage, where he threw them. She had to raise her voice over the rain. Mr. Carter, Daniel, do you know what this is? Do you understand what you drew on these 3 pieces of paper? It's a load distribution model. It's nothing. It's a thing I do at my kitchen table so I don't lose my mind. It's not nothing. The woman laughed a strange, breathless, almost desperate laugh. My engineering team has been working on this exact problem for 14 months. The Harbor Line project. We have 11 engineers and a $2 million software budget, and we cannot solve the load transfer at the tower base without adding 40% to the cost, and it's killing the whole development. 14 months. 11 people. She held up the sketches and her hand was shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. And you solved it in pencil, at your kitchen table, so your daughter's father wouldn't lose his mind. The rain came down between them. Who are you? Daniel said. The woman straightened up. Rain streamed off her, and she stood in the middle of the sidewalk soaked to the bone, and she looked him dead in the eye. My name is Victoria Bennett, she said. It's my name on the building. I own the company that just threw you out into the rain. Daniel didn't say anything for a moment. He couldn't. The words rearranged the whole world, and he needed a second to stand up inside the new shape of it. Then you saw, he said finally. You saw what happened up there. I saw all of it, on the security feed. I saw a man tear up your work and call you a failure in front of my entire engineering floor. Victoria's jaw was tight. And I saw you thank him. That's just manners. No. She shook her head hard, water flying. No, that's not just manners. A man with no self-respect gets loud. A man with too much of it gets loud too. You thanked him. And then you reached into the trash and took your work back and left his insults sitting right there in the garbage where it belonged, and you walked out with your head up. Her voice caught. I've watched a lot of men in a lot of interviews, Mr. Carter. I have never seen anything like that in my life. Daniel looked down at the sketches in her hands. The rain was starting to blur the pencil at the edges. You should get those out of the wet, he said quietly. The graphite runs. Victoria let out a sound that was half laugh, half something else, and pressed the sketches back against her chest to protect them. Come back inside, she said. Please, not for another interview. I'm done with interviews. I watched your interview, and it told me everything I'd ever need to know, and none of it was what that man thought it was. She stepped closer. Come back inside, and let me offer you something. Not a favor. Not charity. God knows you don't want charity, I could see that too. I want to offer you a job. A real one. The one nobody else in my building is good enough to do. Daniel stood in the rain, soaked through $411 in the bank and inhaler. Due in 9 days, a little girl who got out of school at 3 o'clock and would come running out those double doors looking for his face. He should have said yes on the spot. Any sane man would have. But 4 years of being told what he was worth had built something hard and careful inside him, and it didn't melt just because a woman ran through the rain. Why? He said. You don't know me. You saw 4 minutes of me on a screen and 3 drawings I did at my kitchen table. People don't do this. Rich people especially don't do this. So before I say anything, I need you to tell me why. And Victoria Bennett, who had canceled a board meeting, who had run down 14 flights of stairs, who was standing in the middle of a public sidewalk in a ruined suite, clutching a stranger's garbage to her chest, like it was the most valuable thing she owned. Looked at him for a long moment, because 7 years ago, she said, somebody looked at me when everyone else had written me off, and I told myself that if I ever got to be the one at the top of the building, I would never let it happen on my watch that a good person got thrown into the rain because somebody couldn't be bothered to look. Her voice broke, and she let it. And then I watched it happen on my watch anyway, 40 floors down, in my own company, with my name on the door. She held the sketches out to him again, and this time it wasn't a demonstration. It was an offering. So I'm asking you, Mr. Carter, come back inside. Let me be the one who looked. The rain came down on both of them, And Daniel Carter, for the first time in 3 years, for the first time since a doctor had said the word terminal in a hallway that smelled like antiseptic, felt something in his chest that he had almost forgotten the shape of. It felt dangerously, terrifyingly like hope. He didn't trust it. He'd learned not to. But he reached out, and he took the sketches from her hands, and he held them, and he looked down at 8 months of kitchen table pencil work that a stranger had pulled from the trash and carried through a storm. "My daughter gets out of school at 3, he heard himself say. "Her name is Emma. I don't go anywhere. I don't sign anything. I don't believe one word of any of this until I know that whatever I do, I'm home by 3 o'clock. That's the only thing I have left that I don't negotiate. Do you understand me?" Victoria Bennett smiled, soaked, freezing, exhilarated, standing in the wreckage of the worst thing her company had done all year, and the best decision she was ever going to make. 3 o'clock, she said. "I understand you completely." And upstairs, 40 floors up behind a glass wall, Gerald Harrington was still laughing about it with 2 of his managers, still telling the story of the failure in the wet shirt. With no idea at all that the woman who signed his checks was standing out in the rain, and that everything he thought he knew about who mattered in that building was about to come apart in his hands. The elevator ride back up to the 14th floor was the longest 90 seconds of Daniel Carter's life. Victoria Bennett stood beside him, both of them dripping onto the polished floor. Both of them leaving a trail of water that would take somebody an hour to mop. She hadn't stopped holding the sketches against her chest. Daniel watched the floor numbers climb, and he tried to remember how he'd gotten here from the sidewalk to this metal box rising through a building he'd been thrown out of 11 minutes ago. "You're shaking," Victoria said. "I'm cold." "You're not cold." She glanced at him. "You're scared." "It's all right. I'm scared too." "You own the building." "That's exactly why I'm scared." The elevator chimed. "Because in about 10 seconds, 40 people who just watched you get humiliated are going to watch you walk back in with me. And I need you to do one thing for me, Daniel." "What?" The doors opened. "Don't look down," she said. "Whatever happens, whatever they say with their faces, you keep your chin exactly where it was when you walked out. Can you do that?" Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have to. Because the doors slid open onto the 14th floor, and the sound of 40 people typing and talking and drinking their coffee stopped all at once, the way a room goes quiet when a door slams somewhere far off in a house. They stared. The woman at the clipboard, the one who'd called him Mr. Carter like it was a chore, dropped her pen. 2 managers standing by the coffee machine turned around mid-sentence. And through the glass wall of the corner office, Daniel saw Gerald Harrington look up from his desk, and he watched the man's face do something complicated. Something that started as confusion and slid toward the beginning of fear before Harrington caught it and stuffed it back down. Daniel kept his chin exactly where it was. Victoria walked out of the elevator first. She didn't rush. She didn't announce anything. She just walked across the floor in her ruined suit with water dripping off her hair, past the rows of desks, and every single head turned to follow her. And when she stopped in the dead center of the room, she turned around slowly so she could see all of them. "I want everyone to hear this," she said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. 11 minutes ago, a man came into this building to interview for a position on the Harbor Line engineering team. And in front of most of you, he was told he was a failure. His work was thrown in the garbage. Some of you laughed. Nobody moved. Somewhere a phone was ringing, and nobody answered it. "I know who laughed," Victoria said. "I was watching." Daniel saw a young man near the window go pale. "This is Daniel Carter." Victoria turned and looked at him, and then back at the room. 8 years ago, he engineered the East Cantilever on the Ridgeline Medical Tower, which half the people in this room have studied whether they know it or not. 4 years ago, his wife was diagnosed with cancer, and he left his career to take care of her and then to raise their daughter alone after she died. And in the time he's supposedly been sitting at home being a failure, he solved by hand and pencil with no software and no team and no budget, the exact problem that 11 of you have not been able to solve in 14 months. A sound went through the room, not words, just a kind of collective intake of breath. "So here is what's going to happen," Victoria said. Mr. Carter is going to dry off, and then he and I are going to go into the Harbor Line War Room, and he is going to look at everything your team has built, and I suspect he is going to tell us why it hasn't worked. And I want every one of you to think very carefully over the next few days about the difference between what a resume says about a person and what a person actually is. Because I just watched my own company get that difference catastrophically wrong, and it will not happen again while my name is on the door." She was quiet for a second. "Get back to work," she said. "And somebody get this man a towel." And that was the moment, 9 minutes past 10 in the morning, water pooling around his shoes on the 14th floor of a building he'd been evicted from before he'd finished his coffee at home. That Daniel Carter understood his life had just cracked open down the middle, and he had no idea yet which half he was standing on. Somebody got him a towel. A young woman, maybe 25, brought it over folded in both hands, like she was afraid of him, and she said, "I didn't laugh, sir. I want you to know I didn't laugh." And she was gone before he could answer. Victoria touched his elbow. "Come on, the war room's this way. Harrington." And here her voice changed, went flat and cold, and Daniel saw the man himself coming out of his glass office toward them, buttoning his jacket, arranging his face into a smile. Victoria Harrington said, warm as anything, "I didn't realize you'd taken a personal interest. If I'd known this candidate was—" "Don't," Victoria said. "I'm only saying the interview process is designed to—" "Gerald." She stopped walking. She turned to face him, and Daniel watched a woman who had been soaking wet and scared in an elevator 90 seconds ago become something else entirely. You held a man's life's work up in front of 40 employees, and you tore it in half, and you called him a failure. I watched it on the feed. I have it recorded. Do you want to keep talking to me right now, or do you want to go back into your office and think hard about the next thing you say to me?" Harrington's smile didn't fall so much as freeze. "I was doing my job. He has a 4-year gap. Any responsible—" "He has a 4-year gap because his wife was dying." Victoria's voice dropped so low that only the three of them could hear it, and somehow that was worse than shouting. "You had that information in your hands. It was on the resume you tore up. He tried to tell you, and you talked over him. I heard you do it." She let that sit. "Go back to your office." "Victoria, you cannot seriously—" "Go back to your office, Gerald, or clean it out. Your choice. But you're making it in the next 5 seconds. And Gerald Harrington, Executive Vice President, 22 years at the firm, a man who bent rooms toward himself, looked at Daniel Carter for one long second, with something in his eyes that Daniel would remember for a long time. It wasn't shame. Daniel had hoped stupidly for shame. It was calculation. It was a man doing math. It was the look of somebody who has just been embarrassed in front of his subordinates and has decided in that exact moment that it is going to cost the person who embarrassed him. Then Harrington smiled again, smaller this time, and turned and walked back into his glass office and shut the door with a soft click that was somehow louder than a slam. "That man is going to be a problem," Daniel said quietly. Victoria was already walking. "That man has been a problem for 6 years. He's my late father's hire, and he thinks that makes him untouchable. Come on." The Harbor Line War Room was a conference space they'd taken over months ago, and Daniel could tell the second he walked in that it was a room where hope had died slowly. Drawings papered every wall. Coffee cups had colonized every surface. 3 of the 11 engineers were in there when Victoria pushed the door open, and they looked up with the exhausted, hollow faces of people who had been failing at the same thing for so long that they'd stopped believing it could be done at all. "Everybody," Victoria said, "this is Daniel Carter. He's going to take a look." An older engineer, gray-bearded, glasses shoved up on his forehead, looked at Daniel's wet shirt and his cheap briefcase and did nothing to hide his skepticism. "Take a look," he repeated. "At what exactly?" "At all of it," Victoria said. "With respect, Ms. Bennett, we've had structural consultants from 3 different firms in this room. We've had the software vendor's own engineers flown in. If you think some—" He stopped himself, but not soon enough. "If you think a fresh pair of eyes is going to spot something we've missed in 14 months, I'd love to be proven wrong, but I wouldn't hold my—" "What's your name?" Daniel asked. The engineer blinked. Frank. Frank. Daniel set his briefcase down on the one clear corner of the table. He clicked it open. He took out the 3 crumpled rain-blurred sketches, and he laid them flat, and he smoothed them with the side of his hand. Show me the tower base. The real drawings, not the presentation ones. The load calcs at the foundation transfer. I want to see the numbers you don't put in front of investors. Something shifted in Frank's face. It was a small thing. It was the difference between a man being sold something and a man being asked a real question in his own language. They're on the second screen, Frank said slowly. Give me a minute. Daniel didn't sit down. He stood over the table in his wet shirt, and he waited, and Victoria stood by the door with her arms crossed and watched him, and for the first time since she'd chased him into the rain, she let herself wonder if she'd made a spectacular career-ending mistake. She'd bet everything on 4 minutes of security footage and 3 drawings. If Daniel Carter froze up now, if the drawings were a fluke, if the man couldn't do in a room full of skeptics what he could do alone at his kitchen table, then she had just humiliated her own executive, disrupted her entire engineering floor, and staked her judgment on a stranger all before lunch. The numbers came up on the screen. Daniel looked at them for a long time, longer than was comfortable. Frank glanced at Victoria. Victoria didn't move. The rain hammered the windows, and nobody said anything, and Daniel Carter stood there reading columns of figures, the way other men read scripture, and slowly something changed in his posture. His shoulders came down. His head tilted. He leaned in toward the screen. "Oh," he said softly. "Oh, you poor people. You've been fighting the wrong war." Frank stiffened. "Excuse me. You're trying to make the base stronger." Daniel picked up a marker off the table without asking. He went to the whiteboard, wiped a section clear with his forearm, and started drawing. Fast. Cleaner than a man should be able to draw freehand. That's the whole problem. That's been the problem for 14 months. Every solution you've built assumes the load has to be carried straight down through the base, so you keep reinforcing the base, and every time you reinforce it, you add weight, and every time you add weight, you add cost, and that's your 40%. Am I right? 40% over budget and climbing. That's... Frank came closer to the board despite himself. That's about right, because you're carrying the load the way the load wants to go instead of the way it should go. Daniel drew a curve, then another, then a series of lines fanning out from a single point like the ribs of a fan. You don't strengthen the base. You give the load somewhere else to go before it ever gets to the base. You transfer it out and up through the frame here, and you let the whole structure share it instead of stacking it all on one point. He tapped the drawing. It's not a foundation problem. It never was. It's a distribution problem. You've been pouring concrete to solve a geometry problem. The room had gone completely silent. Frank stared at the whiteboard. He took his glasses down off his forehead and put them on and stared at it some more. He looked at the 3 rain-blurred sketches on the table. He looked back at the board. That's... His voice had changed. Something had gone out of it, the skepticism, and something had come into it, and Daniel recognized what it was, because he'd felt it himself once a long time ago before his life fell apart. It was wonder. That's not possible. If you route it through the frame, you'll overstress the... He stopped. He grabbed a marker. He started doing math on the corner of the board, muttering, and Daniel stood back and let him, and after about 90 seconds, Frank stopped writing and stood very still with the marker in his hand. "It holds," Frank said to nobody. "God help me, it holds." He turned around and looked at Daniel Carter, this wet stranger in a shirt, washed too many times, and there was something almost like grief in his face, the particular grief of a proud man realizing how much time he's wasted. 14 months, Frank said. "We spent 14 months, and you'd have gotten there," Daniel said gently. "You were close. You were closer than you think. Sometimes you just need somebody who wasn't in the room when everybody agreed on the wrong answer." And that was the exact moment Daniel would think about it later at his kitchen table, long after Emma had gone to sleep, that he stopped being a failure and started being a threat, because kindness in that room bought him Frank. It bought him the 3 exhausted engineers who came off the walls to crowd around the whiteboard. It bought him a thing he hadn't had in 4 years, which was the feeling of a room turning toward him instead of away. But 4 floors up, it bought him something else. Gerald Harrington was standing in his glass office, watching the war room on the same security feed Victoria had used to watch Daniel's interview. He watched the crowd form around the whiteboard. He watched Frank, who Harrington had personally hired, who reported to Harrington, shake the stranger's hand. He watched Victoria Bennett smile in a way he hadn't seen her smile in 2 years. And Gerald Harrington picked up his phone, and he made a call, and he said, "I need you to pull everything you can find on a Daniel Carter. Structural engineer licensed in this state. There's a gap in his history about 4 years. I want to know what's in that gap, all of it. Financials, medical, everything. I don't care how you get it." He listened for a moment. "I know it's not legal," he said. "That's why I'm calling you and not HR." He hung up. Down in the war room, Daniel Carter had no idea. He was showing Frank how the load transfer geometry scaled up to the full tower, and for the first time in 4 years, he was so absorbed in the work that he forgot to be afraid. And it was 10:48 in the morning, and his daughter got out of school at 3 o'clock, and the clock in the corner of the war room was ticking. And none of the good people crowded around that whiteboard knew that the bad one upstairs had already started digging. Victoria walked Daniel out at 2. She'd tried to keep him longer. He'd said no gently, but with a flatness she was learning meant the subject was closed. 3 o'clock. Emma. Not negotiable. "I need you back tomorrow," Victoria said in the elevator. 8 if you can, 9 if you can't. I'll have a contract drawn up tonight, a real one. Salary, benefits, the daughter on the health plan from day one. I already told legal to expedite it. The asthma's covered, whatever she needs. Daniel looked at the floor numbers going down. "You put my daughter on the health plan before I said yes," he said. "I did. That's a hell of a thing to do to a man who's trying to make a careful decision. I know exactly what it is." Victoria didn't look away. "It's the truest thing I could show you about what kind of place I'm trying to run. You can walk out of here and never come back, and Emma stays on that plane through the end of the year regardless. That's not a bribe. That's just how it should have been all along for everybody, and I lost sight of it, and you walking into my building this morning is the reason I remembered." The doors opened onto the lobby. So, tomorrow. Daniel stood in the elevator doorway with his briefcase and his crumpled sketches and $411 in the bank, and a job offer that would change his and his daughter's entire life. And he did something that surprised them both. "I have to think about it," he said. And he walked out into the gray afternoon, and Victoria Bennett stood in the elevator with her mouth slightly open and the doors closed on her stunned face, and she started despite everything to laugh. Daniel picked Emma up from school at 3 o'clock on the dot. She came running out the double doors in her yellow raincoat, 7 years old. Gap-toothed, looking for his face in the crowd of parents, the way she always did. And when she found it, she lit up like she did every single day. Like her father showing up was a small miracle she got to witness twice a day. And Daniel felt the thing he always felt, which was that whatever else was true, whatever a man in a glass office said about him, he had done this one thing right. This kid felt safe. This kid felt loved. Whatever it had cost, and it had cost everything, that face coming through the double doors was worth it. "Daddy, guess what? I got a star on my reading, and Mrs. Ortiz said I read the whole page without stopping. And can we have the mac and cheese, the good kind? The one in the blue box." "The good kind." Daniel agreed, taking her backpack. "We'll see." "That means no." "That means we'll see." "That always means no." But she was smiling, and she slipped her hand into his, and they walked to the bus stop in the rain under her small umbrella that she insisted on holding herself, even though it meant Daniel got wet, and he let her because it was hers, and holding it made her proud, and a father learns which things to let a kid win. On the bus, Emma fell asleep against his arm, and Daniel looked out the window at the gray city sliding by, and he made the decision. He'd been pretending all afternoon. He hadn't already made. Of course he was going to say yes. He'd known it in the rain. He'd known it in the war room with the marker in his hand and the load transferring cleanly through the frame, and Frank's face going soft with wonder. He'd known it in the elevator when Victoria said the asthma was covered. He'd told her he had to think about it not because he was uncertain, but because 4 years of getting knocked down had taught him that when something good comes running at you through the rain, you check it for teeth before you let it near your child. But he'd checked. And Victoria Bennett was the real thing. He'd staked his whole life on reading people right. You had to raising a kid alone on nothing. And every instinct he had said this woman meant what she said. He'd call her tonight, after Emma was in bed. He'd say yes. He didn't know that upstairs in a glass office, a man had already spent the afternoon on the phone. He didn't know that his old bankruptcy filing was already being pulled. He didn't know that a record service Harrington kept on a private retainer was already 3 hours into the gap in his history prying open the worst year of his life. He didn't know that the therapy he'd gone to after Rebecca died, the grief counseling he'd forced himself into because Emma needed a father who could function, because he'd sat in his car in a parking lot one night, unable to remember how to drive home. He didn't know that those confidential records were about to stop being confidential. He didn't know any of it. He rode the bus home with his sleeping daughter's head on his arm, and he let himself for one evening be happy. He called Victoria at 8:15 from the hallway outside Emma's room, keeping his voice low. "It's Daniel Carter." "I know. I've been staring at my phone for 3 hours like a teenager." A pause. "Is that a yes?" "It's a yes." He heard her exhale. "But I need you to hear the terms first, and they're not about money. Tell me. I'm home by 3 every day. That's not a preference, it's a wall. If you ever need me somewhere at 3 o'clock, the answer is no, and it stays no, and if that's a problem, then this doesn't work, and we should both know it now. Done. When Emma's sick, I'm gone. Same day, no notice, and I don't apologize for it, and I don't make it up on the weekend because the weekend is hers too. Done, Daniel." "You keep saying done like it's easy." "Because you're describing exactly the man I hired," Victoria said. "You think I don't know what you are? I watched you organize your entire non-negotiable life around a 7-year-old before you'd take a job that saves you from bankruptcy. That's not a liability, Daniel. That's the single most reliable thing I've ever seen in a human being. A man who won't break his word to his own daughter is not going to break it to me." A beat. "Is she asleep?" "Just about." "Then go be with her. I'll see you at 9 tomorrow. And Daniel, thank you for not letting one bad man in a glass office be the last word on who you are." Daniel stood in the dark hallway for a long time after she hung up. He went in and checked on Emma. She'd kicked off her blanket. He pulled it back up over her, over the small chest that worked too hard some nights. And he stood there in the dark and watched her breathe in and out, in and out. The sound he'd built his entire life around hearing, and he thought, tomorrow, everything changes. Tomorrow, I get to be somebody's father who also has a future. Tomorrow, the math is different. He was right that everything was going to change. He was wrong about which direction. The first day was good, so was the second. By the third day, Daniel had reorganized the entire Harbor Line structural approach around his distribution model. And Frank, who had shown up on day 2 with 2 boxes of donuts and an apology. Daniel waved off, had become something close to a friend. The engineers who'd laughed at him, or watched him get laughed at, went quiet and then went sheepish, and then one by one came to his desk with questions. Real questions. The kind you only ask someone you've decided is better than you. Daniel answered every one of them the same way. Patiently. Without triumph. He knew what it was to be the one asking. Victoria came down to the war room twice a day. She told herself it was to check on the project. It was not entirely to check on the project. She'd started noticing things about Daniel Carter that had nothing to do with load distribution, the way he lit up at exactly 2:40 every afternoon, gathering his things because it meant Emma was close. The way he talked to the junior engineers, all of them, like their questions mattered. The way he never once, not a single time, mentioned Harrington, or asked for revenge or gloated about the reversal of his fortunes. Daniel Carter had been thrown in the garbage by her company, and he acted like it hadn't happened. He just did the work and went home to his kid. Victoria had spent her whole life around powerful men who nursed grudges like pets. She did not know what to make of a man who simply didn't. On the 5th day, Gerald Harrington got the file. It came to him in a plain envelope hand-delivered, and he sat in his glass office at 7 in the evening after the floor had cleared out, and he read it all of it slowly, and a smile spread across his face that no one was there to see. It was worse than he'd hoped, better from where he sat. The bankruptcy, the years of no income. But it was the medical records that made him lean back in his chair. Grief counseling, twice weekly for 8 months. A note from a therapist about a man in acute crisis. A man who'd had the file used clinical language, but Harrington translated it eagerly in his head a breakdown. The great Daniel Carter, the wonder of the war room, the man Victoria Bennett had chased into the rain, had spent a year of his life so broken, he couldn't remember how to drive home from a parking lot. Harrington read that part twice. "There you are," he said softly to the empty office. "There you are, you failure." He didn't act right away. That was the thing about Gerald Harrington that Daniel had seen in his eyes on the first morning and correctly feared. He wasn't stupid. He wasn't going to storm down to the war room and wave the file around. He'd tried public humiliation once, and it had blown up in his face and put the man on the CEO's arm. No. This time he'd be patient. He'd wait for the moment when it would do the most damage. He'd wait until Daniel Carter had climbed all the way up, until the whole company had bought into the redemption story, until Victoria had staked her reputation on him in front of the people who mattered. He'd wait until the fall would break everything. And there was a date circled on Harrington's calendar for exactly that. The Harbor Line investor presentation. 3 weeks out. The full board, the major investors, the press. The day Victoria Bennett planned to stand up in front of everyone who mattered and unveil the solved project with Daniel Carter beside her as the proof that her judgment was sound and her company had a soul. Harrington slid the file into his desk drawer. He locked it. 3 weeks, he said, down in the war room. 7 o'clock at night, most people gone home. Daniel Carter stood alone at the whiteboard, finishing a calculation, before he went to catch his bus, humming under his breath, thinking about nothing but the clean way the numbers came together, and the fact that Emma had a science project due Friday, and they were going to build a volcano together, the messy kind, the kind that made her laugh. He capped the marker. He looked at his watch. He had time. He'd make the 6:50 bus, he'd be home by 7:30. Emma was with the neighbor, and she'd be waiting at the window like she always was, and tomorrow he'd come back and do it all again. He had no idea a man 4 floors up had just locked his worst year in a drawer and circled a date. He gathered his things. He turned off the war room lights. He said goodnight to the security guard by the elevator, a heavy-set man named Lewis, who'd started saving him a coffee in the mornings, and Lewis said goodnight back and meant it, because Daniel Carter was the rare kind of man who learned the security guard's name, and Daniel rode down to the lobby and walked out into the evening, which for once wasn't raining, and he looked up at the sky and let himself believe all the way down to the bottom of himself that the worst was behind him. It was 7:02 in the evening. He had 3 weeks. The 3 weeks went fast, and they were the best 3 weeks Daniel Carter had lived in 4 years. He built the volcano with Emma on a Friday night, and it erupted all over the kitchen table, orange foam everywhere. And Emma laughed so hard she got the hiccups, and Daniel had to dig out her inhaler just to be safe. And then they cleaned it up together, and he thought, this is what money is for. Not for me, for this. For being able to buy the good baking soda and not worry about it. For the first time in 4 years, he'd stopped doing the math every time she asked for something. The paycheck had hit his account, a real one, more than he'd made in the 2 years before combined, and he'd sat in the bathroom and cried about it quietly, so she wouldn't hear. At work, the Harbor Line project came together like it had been waiting for him. By the second week, Daniel wasn't just solving the base transfer, he was redesigning the whole structural spine, and every change he made saved money, real money. The kind of numbers that made the finance people come down to the war room to see the man doing it. Victoria stopped calling it a rescue and started calling it a breakthrough. The projected savings crossed $100 million and kept climbing. "You understand what you've done," Frank said to him one afternoon, the two of them alone in the war room. You've made this the most profitable project in the company's history. And you did it in 3 weeks after 14 months of the rest of us failing." "We did it," Daniel said. "Stop that." Frank took off his glasses. "You keep doing that, giving it away. I've been in this business 30 years, and I know the difference between a good engineer and what you are doesn't come along but once or twice in a career. Take the credit, Daniel. You earned it the hard way." Daniel didn't answer. Taking credit felt dangerous to him in a way he couldn't have explained to Frank. Every time something good happened, some part of him was already braced for the bill. 4 years of loss had trained him like a dog that flinches at a raised hand. He kept waiting for the other shoe. He didn't have to wait much longer. 9 days before the investor presentation, Victoria took him to lunch. A real restaurant, white tablecloths, the kind of place Daniel would never have walked into on his own. She'd insisted. He'd worn his one good shirt, the same one from the interview, and she'd noticed, and she hadn't said anything. And that was the moment Daniel understood that Victoria Bennett saw everything and chose carefully what to name. "I want to talk to you about the presentation," she said. "I want you on the stage with me, not in the audience. On the stage at the front, presenting the structural solution yourself." Daniel set down his fork. "The investors don't want to hear from an engineer. They want to hear from you. The investors want to hear a story," Victoria said. "And you're the story. A company that was hemorrhaging money on a doomed project saved by an engineer everyone else had written off. That's not just good business, Daniel. That's the thing I've been trying to build this whole company around and never had the proof for. You're the proof." "I don't want to be a story." "I know you don't. That's exactly why it works." She leaned forward. "Here's what I really want to tell you, and I've been trying to figure out how for a week. When my father died and left me this company, everyone said a 31-year-old woman couldn't run it. The board fought me for a year. Harrington fought me hardest. And there was one investor, an old man named Walter Chen, who stood up in a meeting and said he'd back me. Just me. Everyone else's money followed his. He looked at me when nobody else would." Her voice thickened. "He died 2 years ago, and I've spent every day since trying to be worth what he saw. And then you walked into my building, and my own executive threw you in the trash, and I realized I'd been so busy running a company, I'd forgotten to look at people the way Walter looked at me." She wiped her eyes, annoyed at herself. "So yes, I want you on that stage. But not for the investors. For me. Because putting you up there is me finally becoming the person Walter thought he was betting on." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "Okay," he said. "I'll do it." And that was the mistake. Not a mistake of judgment. A mistake of hope. Because a man standing on a stage in front of the entire board and every major investor is a man standing in the exact spot where Gerald Harrington had been aiming for 3 weeks. 6 days before the presentation it started. Daniel noticed it first as a coldness. A junior engineer who'd been coming to his desk with questions stopped coming. Then 2 of them stopped eating lunch in the war room. Then Frank came in one morning, looking like he hadn't slept, and he shut the war room door, which he never did. And he said, "Daniel, I have to ask you something, and I need you to know it's not me asking." "Ask." "There's a thing going around, on the floor, about the years you were out." Frank couldn't look at him. "About a hospital, or I don't know the word. Somebody's saying you were in some kind of facility, that you had a breakdown, that you were," he made a gesture, helpless, "that you weren't well, mentally. And that Victoria hired a man with a documented history of instability to lead a $200 million project, and that when the investors find out they'll pull their money." The war room went very quiet. Daniel felt the old flinch, the raised hand flinch, except this time the hand actually came down. "Where did it come from?" he said. "I don't know. It's everywhere. It came out of nowhere yesterday afternoon, and by this morning everybody's heard some version of it." Frank finally looked at him. "Is it true? I don't care if it's true, I'm asking, because if it's out there, we have to know what we're dealing with." Daniel looked at the man who'd become his friend, and he decided to tell him the truth, because the truth was the only thing he'd never been ashamed of, even when the whole world tried to make him ashamed of it. After Rebecca died, Daniel said, I couldn't function. For a while. I sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot one night, and I couldn't remember how to get home. Emma was 3. She was with a neighbor, and I sat there in the dark and I realized that if I fell apart, that little girl had nobody. So I got help. Grief counseling twice a week for 8 months. I did it so I could be a father. I was never in a facility. I never missed a day of being there for my daughter. I went to therapy because I refused to let my daughter lose 2 parents. He held Frank's eyes. So yes, parts of it are true. I fell apart when my wife died, and I put myself back together on purpose by hand, the same way I do everything. And I am not ashamed of one single second of it. Frank was quiet. Then he stood up and put his hand on Daniel's shoulder, hard the way men do when they don't have the words. That's not instability, Frank said. That's the strongest thing I ever heard. And whoever's twisting it into something ugly is a coward, and I think we both know exactly who. They did both know. That was the thing. There was no proof, but there didn't need to be. Everyone knew. By that afternoon, it had reached Victoria's floor. By evening, it had reached the board. Daniel found out how bad it was when he came in the next morning, 5 days before the presentation, and there was a woman he didn't recognize sitting in the war room. Late 40s, expensive suit, a leather folder on the table in front of her. She stood up when he came in. Mr. Carter, I'm Diane Prescott. I chair the board's governance committee. She didn't offer her hand. We need to talk. About what? About whether it's appropriate for you to represent this company at the investor presentation. She opened the folder, and Daniel saw upside down the top edge of a document he recognized because he'd signed the intake form for it 4 years ago in a small beige office that smelled like a candle somebody kept burning to cover something worse. His therapy records. His actual confidential, legally protected therapy records sitting in a leather folder in his war room. Where did you get those? Daniel said. His voice came out low and even, the same voice he'd used with Harrington, the levelness that cost him everything. That's not the relevant question. It's the only relevant question. Those records are protected by law. Somebody committed a crime to put them in that folder. So before you ask me a single thing, you're going to tell me who gave them to you. Diane Prescott's face didn't change. The information came to the board's attention through appropriate internal channels. What matters now is that it's in front of us, and we have a fiduciary duty to our investors, and we cannot in good conscience put a person with a history of severe psychological crisis on a stage in front of the people whose money keeps this company alive. She slid a paper across the table. The board is prepared to keep you on in a reduced capacity. Behind the scenes, off the presentation, off any public materials, your name comes off the project. My name comes off the project. For everyone's protection, including yours. Daniel looked at the paper. It was a quiet execution dressed up in the language of care. They'd take his work, the thing he'd built the $150 million in savings, and they'd scrub his name off it and hide him in a back room. Because a coward in a glass office had stolen his medical records and whispered the word breakdown down the hallways of the building, until it curdled into unstable, until the exact thing that proved his strength got turned into the case against him. He's still a failure. He could hear it, not out loud. Nobody would say it out loud in a room like this. They'd say fiduciary duty and reduced capacity and everyone's protection. But underneath it was the same thing Harrington had torn in half in front of 40 people 3 weeks ago. A man who fell apart when his wife died doesn't belong up there with the people who matter. Where's Victoria? Daniel said. Ms. Bennett is aware of the situation. That's not what I asked. Where is she? Mr. Carter. Miss Bennett's position is complicated. She hired you, so her judgment is now the thing on trial, along with your history. If she fights the board on this, she's not defending you. She's defending herself, and the board is fully aware of that, and frankly, so is she. Diane Prescott closed the folder. I'd advise you not to put her in that position. The kindest thing you could do for the woman who gave you this chance is to sign this quietly and step back so that her mistake doesn't cost her the company her father left her. And that Daniel understood was the real knife. That was the thing Harrington had built. He hadn't just come for Daniel. He'd rigged it so that the only way to save Daniel was for Victoria to burn herself down, and the only way to save Victoria was for Daniel to accept that he was exactly what they said he was. Daniel stood there and felt 4 years of clawing his way back collapse under his feet. He picked up the paper. He read it. His hand was steady, which surprised him because inside he was in that parking lot again in the dark, unable to remember how to get home. "I need to talk to Victoria," he said, "before I sign anything, face to face. That's not negotiable." "I don't think that's wise. Then it's a good thing I didn't ask you." He set the paper down. "You can tell the board I'm considering it. And you can tell whoever gave you my medical records that I know exactly what they are, and I know exactly who they are, and stealing a grieving man's therapy file is the kind of thing that has a way of coming back around." He picked up his briefcase. "I have to go. My daughter has a doctor's appointment at 11. That's also not negotiable, and it never will be no matter what any of you decide about me." He walked out. He kept his chin exactly where it was. He held it together all the way down the elevator and through the lobby and out onto the street and half a block down, and then he stopped and put his back against a building and closed his eyes, and for the second time in 4 years, Daniel Carter felt the ground go out from under him. His phone rang. Victoria. He almost didn't answer. He did. "Daniel, did you know?" he said. "Did you know they had my medical records before that woman ambushed me in a room I've worked in for 3 weeks? A pause that lasted too long. "I found out an hour ago," Victoria said. "I've been in a closed session with the board since 7 a.m. I got out and called you the second I could. Daniel, I swear to you on Walter Chen's grave, I did not know how bad it had gotten until this morning, and I have never seen those records, and I never will, because they should never have existed in that folder in the first place. Prescott says if you fight for me, you lose the company. Prescott's right." The honesty of it stopped him cold. "She's right," Victoria said again. "If I go into that boardroom and fight for you, they'll say my judgment is compromised, and they'll use it to challenge my control, and Harrington's been waiting 6 years for exactly this opening. It's a beautiful trap, Daniel. I have to give the man credit. He found the one move that makes helping you look like proof I shouldn't be in charge." "Then don't fight," Daniel said. "Sign me out. Take my name off it. Keep your company. I'll disappear. I've done it before. I'm good at it. And Emma and I will be—" "Daniel. We'll be fine. We were fine before. I'm not going to be the reason you lose everything, your father." "Daniel, stop." And there was something in her voice he hadn't heard before, something that cut straight through his panic. "Do you hear yourself? An hour after they showed you the worst day of your life in a leather folder, your first instinct is to protect me, to disappear so I don't get hurt. Do you understand that that is the exact opposite of what a weak or unstable man does? Do you understand that you are at this very moment being stronger than every single person in that boardroom put together?" Daniel didn't say anything. He couldn't. "I'm not signing you out," Victoria said. "And I'm not walking into that boardroom to fight for you either, because Prescott's right, that's the trap, and I'm not going to lose to a man like Harrington by playing the game he built." A breath. "I'm going to do something else. I'm going to do the thing Walter Chen did for me, and I need you to trust me for 5 days, and I need you to do the hardest thing I'm ever going to ask you to do." "What?" "Show up to that presentation," Victoria said, "in 5 days, on that stage, exactly like we planned. Don't sign their paper, don't disappear, don't hide. Walk into that room in front of the entire board and every investor and let them look at you." Her voice was fierce now. "You've spent 4 years being told that the worst thing that ever happened to you makes you less. I'm going to give you a room full of the most powerful people in this city, and you're going to stand up in it and be exactly who you are, and we are going to find out together whether this company has a soul or not. And if it doesn't—" She stopped, and when she spoke again, her voice was perfectly steady. "If it doesn't, then it's not worth keeping. And I'd rather lose it standing next to you than keep it standing next to Gerald Harrington." Daniel stood against the building with his eyes shut and the phone pressed to his ear and his heart going like a hammer. "They stole my daughter's father's medical records," he said quietly, "to make him look crazy, in front of a room full of strangers." "Yes," Victoria said, "they did." "That's what we're walking into." "Yes." Daniel opened his eyes. Somewhere in the last 4 years, he'd forgotten there was another way to answer a raised hand besides flinching. He'd forgotten it in the parking lot, and he'd forgotten it in Harrington's office, and he'd almost forgotten it just now against this building. But Rebecca's voice came back to him clear as the day she'd said it, the thing she'd said in his head in the rain 3 weeks ago. "Don't you dare let a fool tell you what you're worth." "5 days," Daniel said. 5 days. I'll be there, on the stage, and Victoria." He pushed off the building and started walking because Emma had a doctor's appointment at 11, and a man does not stand on a sidewalk falling apart when his daughter needs him. "When this is over, one way or the other, I want to know who put my file in that folder. Not to sue them, not for revenge. I want to look him in the eye and let him see that it didn't work. That's all. I just want him to have to look at me. I think," Victoria said, "that can be arranged." 4 floors up in a glass office, Gerald Harrington watched Daniel Carter walk away down the street on the security feed phone to his ear, and he smiled because he'd heard through Prescott that the man was considering the paper, and a man who considers the paper is a man who's already halfway to gone. He didn't know Daniel Carter had just decided not to sign it. He didn't know Victoria Bennett had just decided to stop playing his game. He didn't know that the trap he'd spent 3 weeks building, the beautiful trap that turned kindness into weakness and strength into evidence, had one flaw in it that he was constitutionally incapable of seeing because he'd never in his life met anyone who had it. He'd built a trap for a man who was afraid of being called a failure. And somewhere in the last 5 days, walking to a bus with his sleeping daughter's head on his arm, crying in a bathroom over a paycheck, telling Frank the truth without shame, Daniel Carter had stopped being afraid of that word entirely. 5 days. The clock was running, and for the first time it wasn't running against him. The 5 days went slow the way the 3 weeks had gone fast. Daniel came to work every one of them. That was the first thing that unsettled the floor. They'd expected him to disappear to take the paper, to slink into a back room. And instead he showed up at 9 every morning, said good morning to Lewis at the security desk, got his coffee, and went into the war room and did the work. He finished the structural spine. He signed off on the final load calculations. He answered every question a junior engineer brought him patiently without triumph, exactly the way he always had. The rumor had turned him into a ghost story on that floor, and every day he walked through it as a living man doing his job and slowly, without anyone deciding to the floor, started to feel ashamed of itself. Frank noticed it first. "They can't look at you," he told Daniel on the 3rd day. "You come in here and you just work, and half of them repeated that garbage last week, and now they can't figure out how to look at you. You're making them face it just by showing up." "I'm not trying to make them do anything," Daniel said. "I'm just not going to let a lie change how I walk into a building." "I know you're not trying to. That's why it's working." 2 days before the presentation, Victoria called him to her office for the first time. He'd never been up to her floor. It was quiet up there, glass and light, and she was standing at the window when he came in, and she didn't turn around right away. "I've been counting votes," she said, "on the board. If it comes to a fight over whether I stay in control, I've got Prescott and 2 others against me. Harrington whispering in all their ears, and 4 I can't read." She turned. "You should know what you're walking into. It's not just your presentation on the line Thursday. It's the company. If the investors get spooked, if they pull out, the board will say, 'It's proof my judgment failed,' and they'll move to strip my control, and Harrington will have what he's wanted for 6 years. So when I say Thursday is everything I want you to understand, I mean all of it." "Then let me sign this paper," Daniel said quietly. "Take me off the stage. Protect the company. I've told you I can." "No." She said it without heat worn smooth from saying it. "I've thought about it from every angle for 4 days, Daniel. If I hide you, I win the day and lose the thing that made me want to keep the company at all. Walter Chen didn't hedge his bet on me." He stood up in a room and put his whole reputation on a 31-year-old woman everyone thought would fail. He didn't do it halfway. Her voice caught. I'm not doing it halfway either. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. You know what I keep thinking about, he said. That first morning, you ran down 14 flights of stairs in the rain because the elevator was too slow. And I keep thinking, who does that? Who ruins a suit and runs down 14 flights for a stranger? He shook his head. And I finally figured it out this week. You weren't running for me. Not really. You were running for whoever Walter Chen saw when he looked at you. You've been trying to be worth that for 7 years, and I just happened to be the man in the rain when the chance showed up. Victoria didn't say anything for a moment. Her eyes were bright. That's the truest thing anybody's said to me in years, she said. And it doesn't make it mean less, it makes it mean more. Thursday came. 8 in the morning. The presentation was at 10. Daniel got Emma up, made her breakfast, dropped her at school. She could tell something was wrong. Kids always can. And at the door, she grabbed his sleeve and said, Daddy, are you sad? No, baby. I'm nervous. There's a big meeting today. Are you gonna do good? Daniel crouched down to her level. I don't know, he said, because he'd promised himself a long time ago he'd never lie to her about the important things. I'm gonna try. Some people there think I'm not good enough, and I'm going to go stand in front of them anyway. Emma frowned, working it out the way 7-year-olds do. That's brave, she decided. Mrs. Ortiz says brave is when you're scared and you do it anyway. Mrs. Ortiz is a smart lady. Can we have the good mac and cheese tonight because you were brave? Daniel laughed and it came out cracked. Yeah, he said. Yeah, tonight we have the good kind, whatever happens. He kissed her head and watched her run through the double doors, and he stood there a second longer than usual, and then he went to catch his bus to the fight of his life. 9:40. He was in the war room in his one good shirt going over his notes when Frank came in and shut the door. There's a problem, Frank said. There's always a problem. No. Listen. Frank's face was gray. Harrington's making a move before you even get up there. Word is he's got Prescott set to raise a point of order the second the meeting opens, before the presentation, to have you removed from the agenda on governance grounds. They're going to do it in front of the investors. They're going to stand up and say the board has concerns about the mental fitness of the lead engineer and move to remove you from the presentation, publicly, before you say a single word. Frank gripped the back of a chair. They're not going to let you present Daniel. They're going to execute you in the doorway. Daniel set down his notes. The old flinch came up in him, the raised hand flinch, and he watched it come, and this time he didn't move with it. He'd spent 5 days learning to stand still inside it. Does Victoria know? I don't know. I came straight to you. Daniel was already moving. He walked out of the war room and across the floor, and people looked up, and he didn't slow down. And he went to the elevator and rode it up to Victoria's floor, and her assistant tried to stop him, and he walked past her, and he pushed open the door to Victoria's office, and she was on the phone, and she took one look at his face and said, I'll call you back, and hung up. Oh. They're going to remove me from the agenda before I present, Daniel said. Point of order, in front of the investors. Prescott raises it, Harrington seconds it, and I never get to say a word. Victoria went very still. How do you know? Frank, it's on the floor. It's why nobody's been able to look at me all morning. Half of them knew and didn't tell me. He watched her. You didn't know? No? She stood up slowly. No, I didn't. Which means somebody on my own board fed it to Frank's people on purpose. They wanted you to know. They wanted you rattled walking in. Her jaw tightened. Or they wanted you to run, right now, this morning, so it never even comes to a vote. The two of them stood there, and Daniel watched Victoria Bennett do the math he'd watched Harrington do 3 weeks ago, except her math ran the other direction. They've outthought me, she said quietly. I planned to put you on the stage and let the work speak. Let the 150 million in savings speak. But if they remove you before you present the numbers, never get heard. And all anybody in that room remembers is that the board stood up and said the lead engineer wasn't mentally fit. The story writes itself, and I never get to tell mine. She pressed her fingers to her eyes. It's good. It's really good. He's better at this than I gave him credit for. So what do we do? Victoria dropped her hand, and something changed in her face, some final thing, the last hesitation burning off. We stop playing his game, she said. Completely. He's built a beautiful machine and every part of it assumes we'll fight on his terms. Governance, procedure, points of order, the board. So we don't. We do the one thing the machine can't process. She looked at Daniel. The presentation's at 10 in the main auditorium. Investors board press the works. When Prescott stands up to raise her point of order, I'm going to yield the floor to her. I'm going to let her do it. I'm going to let her stand up in front of everyone and say the words. You're going to let her, and then, Victoria said, I'm going to answer her, not with procedure, not with a counter motion, with the truth, all of it. The records, how they got stolen, who stole them, what they actually say, and what kind of company we become if we let a man be destroyed for surviving the worst year of his life. Her voice was shaking now, not with fear, with something closer to fury. He wants to do it in public, fine. We'll do it in public. But he doesn't get to pick which truth the room hears. Daniel stared at her. That's insane, he said. If it doesn't work, I lose the company, I know. She came around the desk and stood in front of him. I told you 5 days ago I'd rather lose it standing next to you than keep it standing next to him. I meant it then, and I mean it more now. But Daniel, I can't do the part that matters. I can stand up and defend you. But if it's just the CEO defending her own hire, Prescott's right. It looks like I'm defending my own judgment. The only person in that room who can turn this is you. You have to stand up. After she says the words, you have to be the one who answers. Me. You. Not me talking about you. You. In front of all of them. The thing they're trying to hide you for, you have to walk straight into it and own it out loud. She held his eyes. I know what I'm asking. I'm asking you to stand up in a room full of the most powerful people in this city and tell them the single most private thing that ever happened to you. The thing they stole, the thing they're using as a weapon, and take the weapon out of their hands by refusing to be ashamed of it. I'm asking you to do it with your own daughter's future riding on it, and I have no right to ask. Her voice broke. But I'm asking. Daniel Carter stood in that quiet glass office, and he thought about a parking lot 4 years ago in the dark, unable to remember how to get home. He thought about the neighbor who had Emma that night. He thought about the beige office that smelled like a candle covering something worse, and the 8 months of twice-weekly sessions where he'd learned slowly, painfully by hand, how to be a father again. He thought about how ashamed the world had tried to make him of the bravest thing he'd ever done, and he thought about Emma at the school door that morning. Brave is when you're scared and you do it anyway. Okay, he said. Just that. Okay. Victoria let out a breath that shook. There's one more thing you should know before you walk in there, she said. I've spent 5 days finding out how those records got out. I have it now. Who pulled them, which service, who paid all of it. I could walk into that room and expose Harrington in the first 2 minutes. She paused. But if I do it, it's the CEO destroying an executive who threatened her, and the board circles the wagons, and it becomes about power instead of about right and wrong. So I'm not going to use it first. She picked up a folder off her desk and held it out to him. You are. When the moment's right, you'll know it when you get there. Daniel took the folder. He didn't open it. You're handing me the gun, he said. I'm handing you the truth, Victoria said. What you do with it in that room is yours. I trust you with it more than I trust myself. That's the whole thing I've been trying to say to you for 3 weeks, Daniel. I'd rather put this in your hands than keep it in mine. 10 o'clock. The auditorium was full. Daniel had never seen so many expensive suits in one place. The investors sat in the front rows, the board along a raised table to the side, and there was a small riser of press at the back with cameras, because the Harbor Line unveiling had been billed as a major moment for the company. Daniel sat in the second row where Victoria had put him. He had the folder on his lap. He didn't open it. Victoria walked out to the podium, and the room quieted, and she began. And for about 90 seconds, it was a normal presentation, the project, the timeline, the crisis they'd faced, and then she said, "Before I show you what we built, I want to introduce the man who built it." And she looked toward Daniel, and that was when Diane Prescott stood up at the board table. "Point of order." The room turned. "Ms. Bennett, before you go any further, the board has a matter that must be raised for the protection of our investors." Prescott's voice was smooth, practiced, sorrowful in a way that made Daniel's skin crawl. "It has come to the board's attention that the individual you're about to present has a documented history of severe psychological instability, a breakdown requiring extended clinical intervention. We have a fiduciary duty to disclose that before he addresses this room, and I move that Mr. Carter be removed from today's proceedings pending a full governance review." A murmur went through the auditorium. Daniel felt every eye in the room start to find him. He felt the old heat come up the back of his neck. He kept his chin exactly where it was. At the podium, Victoria Bennett didn't flinch. "Thank you, Diane," she said. "I yield the floor. Say what you came to say, all of it, in front of everyone." Prescott hadn't expected that. Daniel saw at the smallest hesitation a machine hitting a step that wasn't in its program. She'd expected a fight over procedure. She'd been handed the floor. The records indicate that Mr. Carter 4 years ago underwent psychiatric treatment following a personal crisis. The board's concern is straightforward. This is a $200 million project. Our investors are entitled to know that its lead engineer has a history that raises legitimate questions about his stability under pressure, and the board cannot in good conscience. How did the board come to have his medical records? Victoria asked it quietly into the microphone, and it dropped into the room like a stone into a well. Prescott stopped. They were brought to the board's attention through appropriate internal channels. Yes, you told Mr. Carter that too. Victoria let the silence stretch. Diane, those records are protected by federal law. For them to be in your folder, someone committed a crime. So I'll ask again in front of our investors and the press because I think everyone in this room deserves to know. Who gave the board Daniel Carter's stolen medical file? And Daniel understood, sitting in the second row with the folder on his lap, exactly what Victoria was doing. She wasn't defending him. She'd told him she couldn't, that it would look like she was defending her own judgment. So she wasn't. She was asking a question. She was turning the room's attention inch by inch away from what the records said and toward how they'd been obtained, and she was doing it without ever once saying she believed in him, because the moment she said it, it became her word against the board's. Prescott's mouth opened and closed, and Gerald Harrington, sitting 3 seats down at the board table, made the mistake that men like Harrington always make eventually, which is that he could not stand to watch a woman control a room he thought was his. "Oh, for God's sake," Harrington said, and he stood up. "The point isn't how we got the records. The point is what's in them. Let's stop dancing." This man had a nervous breakdown. He sat in his car, unable to function. He spent the better part of a year in therapy because he couldn't cope with his own life. And Victoria wants to put him on a stage as the face of this company's future. He spread his hands to the room, to the investors, performing now the exact gesture Daniel had watched him make 3 weeks ago in a glass office. "I'm sorry, but somebody in this company has to be willing to say the unpopular thing. A failure is a failure no matter how good the story sounds." And there it was. A failure is a failure. The same words out of the same mouth in a bigger room. Daniel Carter stood up. He didn't wait to be called. He didn't ask permission. He stood up in the second row with the folder in his hand, and the whole auditorium turned to look at him. And Victoria stopped talking at the podium, and even Harrington fell silent because there was something in the way the man rose that made a room go quiet. "You're right," Daniel said. It landed like a thunderclap. Nobody had expected it. Harrington least of all. "I did sit in my car," Daniel said, walking slowly toward the front of the room, his voice carrying without a microphone because the room had gone dead silent to hear him. 4 years ago, in a grocery store parking lot, my wife had been dead for 2 months, and I sat there in the dark, and I could not remember how to drive home. That's true. Mr. Harrington got that part exactly right. He reached the front. He turned and faced the investors aboard the cameras. My daughter was 3 years old. She was at a neighbor's house waiting for me. And I sat in that car, and I realized that if I fell apart, she had nobody left. No mother, and a father who couldn't remember the way home. You could hear the room breathing. So I got help, Daniel said. I went to grief counseling twice a week for 8 months. I sat in a small beige office and I did the hardest work of my life, which was learning how to be a whole enough person to raise a little girl by myself. I never missed a day of being her father. Not one. I never once failed to pick her up from school. And at the end of those 8 months I could drive home, and I could make her breakfast, and I could be the thing she needed me to be. He looked at Harrington. Mr. Harrington calls that a breakdown. He calls it instability. He calls it failure. Daniel let the silence sit. I call it the bravest thing I've ever done. Nobody moved. You want to know what failure actually is? Daniel's voice didn't rise. It got quieter, and the room leaned in to catch it. Failure isn't falling apart when the person you love most in the world dies. Any human being with a heart falls apart at that. Failure is what you do next. And what I did next was get up every single morning for a 3-year-old who needed me, even on the mornings I didn't want to get up at all. I did that for 4 years alone, with no help on almost no money, and I never once put myself before her. He turned to the investors. You want to know if I'll hold up under pressure on a $200 million project I've spent 4 years under a kind of pressure most of the people in this room have never felt for a single day. I buried my wife and raised our daughter alone, and I taught myself to solve a structural problem. Your own team couldn't crack in 14 months. And I did it at my kitchen table after she went to sleep, because it was the only time I had. If that's the resume of a failure, then I don't know what a success is supposed to look like. Somewhere in the back, one of the investors, an older man, was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, watching Daniel the way you watch something you didn't expect to see. But here's the part that matters, Daniel said, and now he lifted the folder. And it's the part Mr. Harrington doesn't want this room to think about, because he's very good at getting you to look at the wound instead of the knife. He held the folder up. How did my private medical records, which are protected by federal law, end up in Ms. Prescott's hands? Somebody paid a service to steal them. Somebody committed a crime against a grieving father to turn the worst year of his life into a weapon in a boardroom. He looked directly at Harrington. I know who. I've known for 5 days. It's all in here. The service, the payment, the date, everything. Harrington's face had gone from red to something closer to white. That's a serious accusation to make without... I haven't made an accusation, Daniel said. I haven't said a name. I said I have a folder. He watched Harrington. It's interesting that you already know it's about you. The auditorium made a sound, a collective involuntary sound. And Gerald Harrington cornered humiliated, watching 6 years of maneuvering come apart in a room full of the people he most wanted to impress, did the thing that finished him. He lost his temper. You ungrateful... He was around the board table now, jabbing a finger at Daniel. You'd be nothing without this company. You came crawling in here in that same cheap shirt begging, and I did this company a favor, keeping garbage like you out of it, and she... He wheeled toward Victoria. She dragged you back in off the street like a stray dog because she's too soft and too young to run a company. Her father should never have left to a woman in the first place. The room gasped. Harrington heard himself. Too late. He stopped, but the words were already out, hanging in the air in front of the investors and the board and the cameras, and everyone had heard exactly what he was underneath the smooth suit and the fiduciary duty and the sorrowful voice. Victoria stepped back to the podium. She was very calm now. The calm of someone watching a trap spring on the person who built it. For the record, she said quietly into the microphone, the folder Mr. Carter is holding was assembled by a licensed investigator over the past 5 days. It documents that Gerald Harrington retained a records brokerage service and paid personally out of a discretionary account to obtain Mr. Carter's protected medical files. It's already been provided to outside counsel. Whatever the board decides today, that part is now out of my hands and out of yours." She looked at the board table. "I yielded the floor because I wanted every person in this room to decide for themselves without me telling them what to think, what kind of company we are. So decide, is this," she gestured to Harrington, "who we are? Or is that," she gestured to Daniel. And that was the moment Daniel's phone buzzed in his pocket. He almost didn't look. Every important thing in his life was happening in this room. But 4 years of being a single father meant the phone was never just a phone, and something made him glance at it, and the screen said, "Emma's school," and Daniel's blood went cold. He answered it, right there, in front of everyone. "This is Daniel Carter." He listened. The auditorium watched the color drain out of the man who just commanded the entire room, watched him turn from a figure of strength into a father in the space of 3 seconds, and Victoria saw it happen and stopped breathing. "Which hospital?" Daniel said. His voice had changed completely. "Which hospital? Is she okay?" "Okay, I'm coming. Tell her I'm coming." He lowered the phone. "My daughter's had a severe asthma attack," he said to the room to no one already moving. "They've taken her to the hospital. I have to go." And Daniel Carter, who had just stood up in front of the most powerful people in the city and taken the weapon out of their hands, who was 90 seconds from winning everything. He'd fought 5 days for, dropped the folder on an empty chair, and walked out of the auditorium without looking back, because his daughter couldn't breathe. And there had never once in 4 years been anything in the world that came before that. The doors swung shut behind him, and the entire room sat in stunned silence, because every single person in it had just watched in real time the exact difference Victoria Bennett had been trying to make them see. A man who offered the whole world put it down without a second thought the instant his child needed him. Victoria was already moving too. She grabbed her bag from beside the podium. "This meeting is adjourned," she said. "The board can reconvene without me. I'm going to the hospital." "Ms. Bennett," Prescott started, "you can't simply watch me." Victoria stopped at the edge of the stage and looked back at the room one last time at the investors at the frozen board at Gerald Harrington, standing alone and exposed in the middle of the floor. "You've all just seen everything you need to see." That man walked out on the biggest moment of his career for his little girl without hesitating for 1 second. If you can't tell the difference between that and "she didn't even look at Harrington," and this, then there's nothing left in this company worth me staying for anyway. And she walked out after Daniel, leaving the most powerful people in the city sitting in the wreckage of everything Gerald Harrington had built to decide among themselves what kind of company they wanted to be. The clock on the auditorium wall read 10:31. Somewhere across the city, a 7-year-old girl was fighting to breathe and her father was running. Daniel Carter ran. He ran out of the auditorium and through the lobby, past Lewis at the security desk, who called out, "Mr. Carter," and got no answer, and out into the street, and he didn't wait for a bus because there wasn't time for a bus, and he had no car, and he stood on the curb for 1 wild second with his heart trying to climb out of his throat, and then a black town car pulled up hard against the curb beside him, and the back door flew open. "Get in," Victoria said. He got in. The car was moving before the door closed. "Mercy General," Daniel told the driver. "The pediatric emergency." "He knows," Victoria said. "I told him downstairs." "Daniel, look at me. Look at me." She took his face in both hands, forced his eyes to hers. "She's at the best pediatric ER in the city. They know what they're doing. Breathe. You're no good to her if you walk in there falling apart. Breathe." Daniel breathed. It came out shaking. "She had an attack in September," he said, staring straight ahead. "A bad one. We caught it early. We had the inhaler. We had the nebulizer. But the school just has the rescue inhaler, and if it was bad enough, they called an ambulance." His voice cracked down the middle. "It had to be bad, Victoria. They don't call an ambulance unless it's bad." "Then it's good she's already there." Victoria still had his face. "It's good they moved fast. Fast is good. Stay with me." "I left her this morning," Daniel said, and now the thing underneath was coming up, the thing he'd been holding down since the phone rang. She asked if I was sad, and I told her I was nervous, and she said I was brave, and I let her go through those doors, and I got on a bus to go fight about my reputation. The word came out like it tasted foul, about my name being on a project while she was— "Stop!" Victoria's voice was sharp. "Stop that right now. You did not do anything wrong. You dropped everything the second they called. You were out of that room before I even stood up. Do you hear me? There is not a father alive who moved faster than you moved. Whatever you're about to do to yourself in your head, don't. She needs you clear." The car ran 2 red lights. The driver was good. Daniel watched the city blur past, and he did the only thing he knew how to do, which was the thing he'd learned in the beige office 4 years ago. He put his hands on his knees. He counted his breaths. He made himself be the father who could function, instead of the one who sat in a parking lot in the dark. By the time the car pulled up to the emergency entrance, he was steady. Not calm. Steady. There's a difference, and Daniel had learned it the hard way. He was out of the car before it fully stopped. Victoria threw money at the driver and ran after him. The pediatric ER was chaos and fluorescent light, and the particular smell that Daniel would never in his life stop associating with the worst days. He went straight to the desk. "Emma Carter, my daughter. She came in by ambulance asthma, she's 7. The nurse checked a screen. "Your dad." "I'm Dad. She's in Bay 4. They've got her on a nebulizer and steroids, the doctor's with her." But Daniel was already gone, following the pointed finger, and the nurse called after him, something about signing in, and it bounced off him because, through a gap in a curtain, he'd seen a flash of yellow. Emma's raincoat folded on a chair, and he went through that curtain like it wasn't there. She was so small on the bed. That was the thing that hit him every time, how small she got when she was sick. This kid who filled their whole apartment with noise and light, shrunk down to a small pale shape with a mask over her face and her chest working too hard. But her eyes found him the second he came through the curtain, and they went wide, and she reached out one hand, and Daniel crossed the room and took it in both of his. "I'm here, baby. Daddy's here. I've got you." Emma's eyes filled. She couldn't talk with the mask, but she gripped his hand with everything she had, and Daniel bent down and put his forehead gently against hers, careful of the mask, and he stayed there. "You're doing so good," he whispered. "You're breathing so good. I'm so proud of you. I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere. Not anywhere. You just breathe. I've got the rest." The doctor was there, a young woman with kind, quick eyes, and she waited until Emma had settled a little before she spoke to Daniel quietly. "Dad, I'm Dr. Reyes. She's going to be okay. I want you to hear that first. She came in a pretty severe attack. Her oxygen was low, but the ambulance crew did everything right. And we got the nebulizer going fast, and she's already responding. Her numbers are climbing. Another 20 minutes on the treatment, and I think we're going to be looking at admitting her overnight for observation, not anything worse than that." Daniel closed his eyes. The relief was so violent, it was almost like pain. "Overnight," he said, "just to be safe. She's not out of the woods, but she's walking toward the edge of them, and fast. You got here quick. That matters to her. Being here matters more than any medicine I've got." Dr. Reyes glanced at Emma, who hadn't let go of Daniel's hand. "She's been asking for you since the ambulance. Ask isn't the right word. She's been reaching. Kids do that. They reach for the person who makes them feel safe." Daniel looked at his daughter reaching for him from a hospital bed, and he thought about a man in a glass office who'd said a failure like him didn't belong. And he thought, "You were so wrong. You were so completely wrong about what a man is worth. This is what I'm worth. This hand." That was when he realized Victoria was standing just inside the curtain, and she'd heard all of it, and she was crying without making any sound at all. The next hour was slow in the way that only hospital hours are slow. Emma's numbers climbed. The awful working of her chest eased and eased more until she was just a tired little girl on a big bed, and they took the heavy mask off and left her with a smaller one, and she could talk again in the small, croaky voice she got after an attack. "Daddy?" "Right here. I couldn't breathe at recess." She said it matter-of-factly, the way kids report the facts of catastrophe. "I told Mrs. Ortiz and she got the office, and then there was the ambulance, and it had a siren. On for me." A pause. Was your meeting good? Daniel laughed, and it came out wet. I left my meeting, baby. The second they told me you were sick, I left. Emma frowned. But you were being brave. Leaving was the brave part, Daniel said. The bravest thing I did all day was walk out that door to come find you. Emma seemed to accept this. Her eyes were getting heavy. Then she noticed Victoria standing quietly by the curtain, and she studied her with the frank interest of a 7-year-old. Who are you? This is my friend Victoria, Daniel said. She works with me. You have a friend, Emma said, with such genuine surprise that Victoria let out a startled laugh, and Daniel put his face in his hand, and even the exhaustion in the room cracked open for a second. I do have a friend, Daniel admitted. It's new. I'm Emma, Emma told Victoria solemnly. I'm 7. I had an ambulance today. I heard, Victoria said, coming closer, crouching down by the bed so she was at Emma's level. That's a pretty big deal. You know what, Emma, your dad ran out of a room full of very important, very fancy people to come be with you. He didn't even think about it. He just ran. Emma considered this as though it were the most natural thing in the world, which to her it was. That's 'cause he's my dad, she said simply, and closed her eyes and was asleep in the space of 3 breaths. Victoria stayed crouched by the bed for a moment, looking at the sleeping child, and then she stood and turned away and wiped her face with the back of her hand hard twice, and when she turned back, she was composed. I'm going to make some calls, she said quietly. Not about the board, about her. I want to make sure she has whatever she needs. The best pulmonologist in the city, follow up all of it, and I don't want you to fight me on it, Daniel, because I'm going to do it whether you fight me or not, so save your strength for her. Victoria. I mean it. This isn't charity, and it isn't guilt, and it isn't the company. This is a person doing a thing for another person, because she can, and God help me if you say the word charity to me one more time, I'm going to lose it in a pediatric ER. Her voice was fierce and thick. Let me do this, please. Let somebody carry something for once. You've carried every single thing alone for 4 years. Let me take one thing off the pile. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. And the thing he'd been holding at arm's length for 3 weeks, the wary, careful thing that 4 years of loss had built in him, finally set down its guard. Okay, he said. Thank you. And this time he didn't say it the way a drowning man says air. He said it the way one person says it to another when they've decided to let them in. Victoria stepped out to make her calls. Daniel pulled the chair up to the bed and sat down and took Emma's hand again and watched her breathe in and out, in and out. The sound he'd built his whole life around, and for a while there was nothing in the world but that. It was almost 2 hours later, with Emma sleeping soundly and her numbers holding strong, that Victoria came back into the bay and her face had changed. The board reconvened, she said quietly so as not to wake Emma. After we left, I've been getting updates. Daniel's stomach tightened. He'd almost forgotten there was a world outside this room. And I need to tell you what happened, and I need you to not have a big reaction because your daughter's asleep. Victoria pulled up the second chair. After you walked out, the whole room saw it, Daniel. They saw a man drop the biggest moment of his career on the floor and run out the door for his little girl without a half-second of hesitation. And then they saw Harrington standing there in the middle of the room, having just said out loud in front of everyone that a woman shouldn't be running the company and that you were garbage. Those 2 things happened 90 seconds apart. She almost smiled. It turns out that's a very clarifying thing for a room full of people to watch back to back. What happened? Walter Chen had a son. Victoria's voice went soft. Daniel Chen. He's on the board now, took his father's seat when the old man died. He's quiet. I never knew where he stood. He sat through this whole thing, not saying a word, for 5 days for the whole meeting. She paused. And after you left, he stood up. And he said that his father had told him one story about this company more than any other. The story of the day Walter Chen stood up in a room where everyone had written off a 31-year-old woman and put his whole reputation behind her because he'd learned in 80 years that the measure of a person isn't the smooth part of their life. It's what they do in the broken part. Her eyes filled again. And then Daniel Chen said, "And I'm going to get this exactly right, because someone wrote it down for me," he said. "My father is dead, and I've spent 2 years wondering if I'd know the moment if it ever came again. The moment to stand up in a room and back the right person when it costs something. I think I just watched that man." She gestured toward the bed toward Daniel. "Walk out of this room, and I'll be damned if I'm going to sit here and be on the wrong side of the exact thing my father built his life around." Daniel didn't say anything. He couldn't. "He called for a vote," Victoria said. "Not the vote Prescott wanted. His own. A vote of no confidence in Gerald Harrington, effective immediately for the theft of protected medical records for conduct unbecoming, and for his words, saying the quiet, ugly thing out loud in front of 40 witnesses and a bank of cameras." She let out a breath. It passed. Daniel, it wasn't even close. Even Prescott voted for it once she understood which way the wind was blowing, because that's the kind of person Prescott is. Harrington was removed from the board and terminated from the company before you and I even got Emma stabilized. Security walked him out. He's gone. The bay was very quiet. Emma breathed in and out. "He's gone," Daniel repeated. "He's gone. And it's worse for him than just gone, because the medical records theft is now with outside counsel and the district attorney's office has already been in touch. What he did is a crime, Daniel. A real one. He turned a grieving father's therapy into a weapon, and it's going to follow him for a very long time, and there is not a single thing about that I feel sorry about." Victoria's jaw was tight. "He built a machine to destroy you, and the one thing it couldn't account for was that you'd rather run to a hospital than stay and win. Your love for your daughter is the thing that broke his machine. He never had a chance against it. He never even understood what it was." Daniel looked at Emma. At the small mask, the steady rise and fall. "And the project?" he made himself ask. "The presentation never happened. The investors are in." Victoria actually smiled now. "Daniel, they didn't need the slides. They watched the whole thing." The old man in the back row. "Hollings? He's the biggest one. He stopped me on my way out, and he said, and I quote, 'I've put money into 40 companies run by people who talk about their values. I just watched 2 people show me theirs in real time. I'm in for the full round, and I'm bringing 3 others." She shook her head. "The story I was going to tell on that stage, the one about a company with a soul, I never got to tell it. You told it for me. You told it by walking out that door. It was better than any presentation I could have given because it was true, and everybody in that room knew it was true because nobody performs running to a sick child. You can't fake that. And they knew it." Daniel put his face in his hands, not from grief, from the sheer overwhelming weight of a thing finally, after 4 years, breaking the right way. Victoria let him have the moment. Then she said gently, "There's one more thing, and it can wait if you want it to wait. But I think you should hear it now." Daniel lifted his head. "The board, Daniel Chen, actually. It was his idea. The board wants to make you Chief Structural Officer. A new position. You'd run engineering, not just Harbor Line. All of it. Your name on the projects, a real salary, a real title, a seat at the table where the decisions get made." She held up a hand before he could speak. "And I told them the terms before I told you the offer, because I know you and I wasn't going to bring you something you'd have to fight about. So here are the terms already agreed to, already in writing. You're home by 3 every day. When Emma's sick, you're gone, no notice, no questions. Your hours are your own as long as the work gets done, and the work always gets done, because you're the best I've ever seen. The whole thing is built around her. Around that." She nodded at the bed. "I built the job around your daughter, Daniel, because the thing that made every powerful person in that room believe in this company was watching you put her first. It would be insane to hire you and then ask you to stop being the exact man we hired." Daniel looked at his sleeping daughter and then at Victoria Bennett, who 3 weeks ago had run down 14 flights of stairs in the rain for a stranger, and who had just handed him not only everything he'd fought for, but the one condition that made it worth having. "You built the job around Emma," he said. "I built the job around Emma." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached over and very carefully, so as not to wake her, tucked the blanket up around his daughter's shoulders, the same gesture he'd made 1,000 nights in a dark apartment, when it was just the two of them against the whole world. "Yes," he said. "I'll take it." And then after a moment, quieter. "Rebecca would have liked you, my wife. She'd have liked you a lot. She used to say the same thing your Walter Chen said, that you find out what people are made of in the broken part." His voice thickened. "She'd have looked at the last 3 weeks, and she'd have said, 'See, Danny. See, I told you not to let a fool tell you what you're worth.'" Victoria's eyes were bright. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was." Daniel looked at Emma. "She's right there. Every day, that whole face is her." They admitted Emma overnight, and she was fine, better than fine cranky, and demanding Jell-O by evening, which Dr. Reyes said was the best possible sign. Daniel didn't leave her side. Victoria brought them dinner from somewhere far too nice for a hospital room, and Emma declared the fancy mac and cheese unacceptable, and demanded the blue box kind, and Daniel promised her they'd have it the very next night, the good kind at home, and Emma made him pinky swear, and he did. That was the moment Daniel would think later, that the last 4 years finally let go of him. Not the boardroom. Not the job offer. His daughter's pinky hooked around his in a hospital bed demanding mac and cheese alive and breathing and safe. That was when it ended, and the new thing began. The months that followed moved fast. Daniel led the Harbor Line project to completion, and it was everything he'd promised and more. The load transfer design that he'd sketched at his kitchen table, the thing Harrington had crumpled into a ball and called napkins, became the structural spine of a development that came in $180 million under the original projections. But the number that mattered to Daniel wasn't the savings. It was that the cost reduction let the developers keep 400 units as affordable housing that would otherwise have been cut. 400 families who'd have a safe, solid, well-built place to live. Daniel walked the site the week the first families moved in, and he watched a father about his own age carry a little girl about Emma's age up the steps into a new apartment. And he had to turn away for a minute and get himself together. The engineers who'd laughed at him, or watched him get laughed at, became his team. Frank became his second in command and his closest friend, and never once in all the years after did either of them mention the way it had started, because they didn't need to. The young woman who'd brought him the towel that first morning, the one who'd said, "I didn't laugh, sir." Daniel made sure she got the promotion she'd earned, and she cried in his office, and he pretended he had something in his eye. Gerald Harrington was charged. It took the better part of a year, but the theft of protected medical records was not a small thing, and it came with the ugliness of a man who'd made a lot of enemies on his way up, all of whom were suddenly very willing to talk once he was down. He never worked in the industry again. Daniel never once gloated about it, never once celebrated it, and when someone brought it up in the office, he'd change the subject because he'd meant what he said in the auditorium. He'd never wanted revenge. He'd only wanted the man to have to look at him and see that it hadn't worked. And he'd gotten that. In the boardroom in front of everyone, he'd gotten exactly that. That was enough. It had always been enough. Emma grew. Her asthma stayed managed, watched over now by the best pulmonologist in the city, the attacks fewer and milder, and the terror that had lived in Daniel's chest for 4 years. The constant low hum of, what if I can't afford the medicine? What if the next one is the bad one? What if I fail her? That terror finally slowly quieted. Not gone. A parent's fear is never gone. But quiet. Manageable. Carried now on a pile that wasn't his to carry alone anymore, because Victoria was there. It happened slowly, the way the real things do. Dinners that started as work and stopped being work. A woman who learned that Emma liked her stories told in funny voices, and turned out to be shamelessly wonderfully good at funny voices. A little girl who stopped being surprised that her dad had a friend and started saving up things throughout her day to tell that friend. And one evening without ceremony called her something other than Victoria. And Daniel watched Victoria Bennett, who ran a company, who bent boardrooms, who had run down 14 flights of stairs in the rain, go completely still, and then have to leave the room for a minute to collect herself. They took it slow. They had reason to be careful, both of them, each carrying their own history. But it built the way good structures build: load, transferred cleanly weight, shared nothing, stacked on one point, until it broke. Daniel had spent his whole career on that principle, and it turned out to be true of more than buildings. A year and a half after a man tore his resume in half and threw it in the garbage, Daniel Carter stood at the ribbon cutting for the completed Harbor Line development on the steps of the tower, whose base he'd redesigned at his kitchen table in pencil. He wore a good suit now, a real one, but he still had the old one in the closet at home, the washed thin shirt from the interview, and he'd never throw it out because a man should remember where he stood. Victoria was at the podium. Emma 9 now stood beside Daniel, holding his hand in a new dress, proud as anything, telling the reporter next to her that her dad designed the whole building, the whole thing, with math at their kitchen table. And Victoria at the microphone in front of the investors and the press and the 400 families who now had homes told the story. Not the polished version. The true one. She told them about a morning 18 months ago when a man walked into her building for an interview and was thrown out into the rain, and about the security feed she'd been watching, and about running down 14 flights of stairs because the elevator was too slow, and about 3 crumpled drawings she'd pulled out of a garbage can. "I chased him down the street," she said, "because I could not let him disappear. And I told him something that day in the rain. I told him he hadn't failed, that they had failed to see his value." She looked out at Daniel and Emma standing at the front of the crowd. "I want to tell you what I know now that I only suspected then. I told him he hadn't failed as a comfort, as a kind thing to say to a good man in a hard moment. But I was wrong to say it as a comfort because it wasn't a comfort. It was just the truth." Daniel Carter never failed at anything in his life. He buried his wife and raised his daughter alone, and taught himself to build the thing you're all standing in front of in the hours after his little girl fell asleep. The man they called a failure built this. He built the homes 400 families are moving into this month. And he did it as the same man who, at the single most important moment of his career, in front of every person who could make or break him, walked out the door without a backward glance because his daughter needed her father. She had to stop for a moment. "We spend so much time," she said, "judging people by the smooth chapters, the clean resume, the years without a gap. And we throw away the ones who had to stop, who had to sacrifice, who had to fall apart and put themselves back together by hand. We call that a failure. We call it a red flag. We throw it in the garbage." Her voice was steady and clear, and it carried out over the whole crowd. "I am here to tell you from personal experience that the gap in a good person's history is not the place where they failed. It is very often the place where they were being the bravest and the strongest and the most human they will ever be. And if you're lucky, if you're paying attention, sometimes you get the chance to be the one who runs down the stairs, to be the one who looks when everyone else has looked away." She found Daniel's eyes and held them. "It is the best thing I have ever done. And I would run down those stairs 1,000 times over to get to this exact day." The crowd applauded. The ribbon was cut, and in the noise and the cameras and the crowd, Emma tugged her father's hand and looked up at him. "Daddy," she said, "is that our building?" Daniel Carter looked up at the tower he'd designed, the one that stood because he'd figured out how to let the whole structure carry the weight together instead of stacking it all on one breaking point, which was, he'd come to understand, the only way anything worth building ever stood at all. He looked down at his daughter, who could breathe, who was safe, who had never once in her life doubted that her father would come when she reached for him. "Yeah, baby," he said, and his voice was thick, and he didn't try to hide it. "It's our building." And it was. It had his name on it, and it always would, because a man had once looked at that name and torn it in half and thrown it in the trash, and a woman had pulled it back out of the garbage and carried it through the rain, and refused to let the world be a place where that was the end of the story. Daniel Carter had been told he didn't belong. He had been called a failure to his face in front of 40 people, and then again in front of 200. He had lost his wife, spent his last dollars, sat broken in the dark, unable to find his way home. And he had gotten up every single morning anyway for a little girl who needed him, and he had carried it all alone until the day someone finally saw him. The man they threw away built the building they all came to celebrate. He raised the daughter who stood beside him. And he proved once and for all to everyone who had ever measured a human being by their worst chapter, the only thing that had ever really been true a person's worth was never in the smooth and unbroken years. It was in what they did when everything broke, and they got up anyway, and they refused to put anyone down but themselves. Daniel Carter was never a failure. He was the strongest man in every room he was ever thrown out of. And in the end, the whole world finally saw it too.